gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today I'm here with a Kickstarter preview for Astro Knights. This is an upcoming game from Indie Boards and Cards, and while I don't take too many Kickstarter previews, I took this one because this is essentially a successor to Aeon's End, which is one of my top deck builders of all time, and also one of my top 10 solo games. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of how this one plays, and then we're going to go to some final thoughts, where I assess it as a game, and also as a follow-up to Aeon's End.
All right, so this is a solo setup for Astro Knights. Astro Knights is a cooperative deck building game, which means that you can play just one Astro Knight or you can multi-handed play up to 4, whatever suits you as a player. But I thought this would be a good moment to show off the pure one-player setup. This game is a streamlined successor to Aeon's End, so if you know that game well, a lot of this overview is going to look very familiar. I'm also going to try to highlight some differences after talking about gameplay to give you a sense of whether this new iteration is a good choice for you. But essentially in this game, you are playing as an Astro Knight or Astro Knights, and there are several to choose from. And these are heroes from all over the universe who are going to be defending a homeworld. There are a few different homeworlds in the game as well, against one of the game's bosses. And this starting set is going to have 4 different bosses with different difficulty levels. There is scalable difficulty for each boss, which we're going to get into, but also the bosses themselves have different starting difficulties. The range of possible challenge is 1 to 10. Furion is a 2. He's the best starter boss. But then Continua here is a challenge rating of 8, so watch out. Each boss also has a different setup, so this setup is unique to Furion. There may be changes for other bosses, but we'll go into some specifics in a moment. First, let's talk about the real hero of this game, our Astro Knight. So here we have Zach. Let's zoom in on him. So every one of your Astro Knights is going to have a front side that you're going to actually use during play, and then a back side that you use during setup. So here, Zach has a little personnel file with a name, a designator, a planet of origin, a specialty. This is the first part that's really of strategic importance, because we know that Zach is good at late damage and early damage. So if you're looking for Astro Knights that allow you to try a certain strategy, there's some hints on the backs of these mats that'll tell you what you might be looking for. You're gonna get some general flavor text, and then here you have a key aspect of setup, your starting hand and your starting deck. This is a little different for each of the Astro Knights, so you're gonna wanna pay attention per Astro Knight. So we know that in Zach's starting hand, we're gonna have 3 power core, 1 tectonic repeater, and 1 blaster. And then in his starting deck, he's going to have 4 power cores and another blaster. So here are the cards that are in Zach's opening hand. He has a weapon, which we're going to talk about in a moment. A second weapon, also important. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And then some power cores. And these are essentially the currency in this game that lets you purchase more cards for your deck. So once you've sifted out your Astro Knights opening hand and deck, and you've gotten that all ready to go, then you go over the other side and you finish setup. So Zach has a starting health of 10. A starting power of 0, and we'll talk about that. And then he starts with only 1 slot. So that tells you how many weapons Zach can equip at any given time. If you're an Aeon's End player, yes, it's like having spell slots. And then if you have more than 1 player, or just for fun here, you can put your player number down here. So Zach is player 1. There's only a player 1, so that's what it is for this solo setup. But if you're playing with up to 4 people, you'll designate your number here on your Astro Knight mat. Our boss, likewise, is going to have some unique setup. If you look on the back, we're going to get some key information about the boss before we actually do the boss setup. So the scouting report is just going to be a bit of flavor text if you want to get into the world of the game. You have your boss's starting health, which is going to be reflected on the boss health tracker. This is a prototype, so you're going to get a nice dial for this in the actual published version of the game. And then you're going to get specific instructions about setup. In this case, we're going to shuffle all the artillery cards and place them to the right of the boss mat. And then we're going to flip this mat over and place the boss cube on the 0 space of the artillery track. We can also see that Furion has a challenge rating of 2, which means that this is the easiest boss in the box. So we'll flip it. I've just been putting random cubes on things. I think this may actually be the boss cube, so we'll put it here. And we'll give Furion a little health tracker right here. We also have a homeworld. Each homeworld has its own special ability and health. In this case, I've chosen Chorus. And so that homeworld card is here. I've set its power to 0 for now, although that will change throughout a game. And then I've also got the homeworld health tracker with the health set to 28 because that matches what's here on the card. So essentially this is a game where the Astro Knight is defending and sometimes using powers from the homeworld to fight against this boss. There are a couple more aspects of this setup that I want to talk about. Then I'll describe a general turn order, and then we'll move to some final thoughts where I talk about how I like this game, and for those of you who are Aeon's end players, how I think it compares. The first thing I want to talk about is turn order. We have variable turn order in this game. So in Astro Knights, as in Aeon's End, you don't actually know whose turn is next. There is a turn order deck that randomizes that for you, at least to an extent. You know how many turns everyone is getting, you just don't know when that turn is going to happen. There are instructions for how to set this deck up at various player counts, but for a solo game with one Astro Knight, you are going to construct this deck with the 1, 2, and 3 player cards, and then 2 boss cards. So you'll get 3 turns for every 2 of the boss's turns. This might feel a little bit funny because if you are playing two-handed, each of your Astro Knights gets 2 turns, and then the boss gets 2 in a given round. So there are actually more Astro Knight turns versus the boss when you're playing multiplayer. However, in the solo game, you also don't lose the game when your character is exhausted, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. In this case, we have the player cards, the boss cards, and we would shuffle this to determine the turn order for an upcoming round. We also have the market, which is a really key aspect of any deck builder. And this one has a market that's not quite like any of the markets I've seen in other deck builders. It's like a mashup of what we had in Aeon's End and other deck builders with a river, something like Star Realms or Ascension. So what we're going to get in Astro Knights is a market that tries to combine randomization and control. So there are 6 decks in the market, and that's on purpose because one of them is tech. So just all the tech goes here. Tech cards are basically cards that have an effect that takes place instantly, and you don't have to equip them like weapons. You have 2 fuel decks. Fuel is the currency that you use to buy further cards. So you might want to spend some of your early fuel to get better fuel, which will give you a better chance on the market. In Astro Knights, you have a cheaper fuel deck and a more expensive one. And that's also true for this bottom row of decks. These are weapons, but essentially it goes 2 to 4, 5 to 6, and 7 to 8 in terms of fuel cost to purchase the weapon. So the idea is that you're always going to be able to get something that you need, a tech, a fuel, or a weapon that's in your price range. You just may not know exactly what it is, and it's going to be slightly randomized per game. I also want to talk about boss leveling. So Furion may have a challenge rating of 2, but that's not quite where it ends. Furion, like all bosses, will become more difficult to play throughout the game, so let's talk about that part first. If you look at Furion's boss deck right now, there are only 2 cards in it, and that's because the only cards that start in your boss's deck correspond to the number of players there are. So these are the only all-player cards. Everything else is 2 players plus. In a lot of games that scale their decks for player count, you might see something that says 3+ or 4 and think, oh, I don't even need that in the game. That is not true in Astro Knights. You are still going to play against those higher level cards. They're just going to show up after the boss levels. So in Astro Knights, every time the boss runs through the boss deck, which is going to be very fast at lower player counts a lot of the time, they're going to reshuffle those decks, and they're also going to level up. So in this case, once Furion goes to level 2, the minions all come in with an extra 4 health. Every minion that's currently in play will gain 4 health, and Furion's going to increase his artillery track, which is not the best outcome. So the boss levels as you play and gets more and more difficult, so you're going to want to seal the deal as fast as you possibly can. And then on top of that, you can actually make each boss a little bit more difficult. They're going to have expert and nightmare cards that give you some additional rules to make playing any given boss a bit more challenging. So depending on the experience that you want to have, Astro Knights is going to try to let you have it. All right, let's have a quick look at turn order before we go on to some final thoughts. I'm gonna take you through player turn order and boss turn order, but I'm gonna let the deck decide which one of those comes first. So let's flip our first turn order card. All right, so player 1 would have been me. It's me, it's always me, but I would get to go first in this particular round. So essentially, when you play, on a player turn, you start with the attack phase. I won't have one in this particular turn because I haven't equipped any weapons to attack with. Just like the spells in Aeon's End, if that is a touch point for you, in order to attack with a weapon, you have to equip it first. And then at the beginning of your next turn, you can choose whether to fire it off and what boss or minion, because you'll have minions to fight as well, you want to fire it at. There are also going to be things that you can do during the game to increase the number of weapon slots you have available. You can spend fuel to do that, and there is a cost on your mat. From this opening hand, I would have some choices. What I might do in this situation is decide that I'm going to equip my blaster because it deals 1 damage, and then hold my tectonic repeater for my next turn because I can return a weapon from my discard pile to my hand, which is pretty useful. One thing that's very important about Astro Knights, just like its predecessor Aeon's End, is that you do not shuffle your discard pile. So the order in which you discard things has a major impact on the game and is a really important part of play. Also, it's really convenient not to have to shuffle, not even gonna lie. The other thing that is true is that you have a hand limit of 5, but you can actually hold cards from turn to turn. So what I'd probably do is equip this weapon, hold on to this weapon, and only spend and discard these fuel cards, these power cores. So I have 3 of them. I can spend my 3 money to purchase something that's worth 3. So one thing that's a little bit difficult about the market as it currently is that doesn't help me very much. There's only one card I can buy, the Solarius Cell. So I'm gonna buy this Solarius Cell. It goes in my discard pile. This card says that when you buy it, the homeworld powers up. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and it'll be worth 2 fuel the next time it comes out of my deck. I'll put it in discard, power up my homeworld because when it reaches full power, it can activate its special power. And then I'll flip this over and see what was next on this deck. So those are an example of some of the actions you can take. You can always play a fuel or tech. You can always equip a weapon. You can always buy a card. So those are the things that I did this turn. You can also overcharge a tech by paying its cost, resolving its effect, and placing it on the bottom of the supply deck. Pay fuel to gain a slot, so let yourself get more weapons. Pay fuel to power up so that you can use your own special ability. You can activate your ability if you are fully powered up. And you can also activate your homeworld's ability if it's fully powered up. So during the main phase, there are a few different things that you might be choosing to do depending on your power situation, your card situation, and the boss situation. After that, you do exactly what I did, which is place all the fuel and tech you've played this turn into your discard pile. And then if you have any cards in your hand that you have not played, you can keep them, which I'm going to do, or discard them. Then I would draw up until I had 5 cards in my hand. So I'll draw 4 cards, and then I have 1 left in my deck. So at the end of my first turn, I'm going to be set up to have a nice purchasing round with all of this fuel. I'm going to be able to do damage and equip another weapon, and that's a pretty good start to any game of Astro Knights. Then let's just say that the next turn is, oh no, a boss turn. So how does the boss turn work? Basically what will happen is you're going to have a main phase. So if there's a level token, you're going to resolve its effect. These are cards, not tokens, but they're going to be tokens by the time the published game arrives. And then you're also going to resolve the activate effect of each minion who's in play from oldest to newest. So as cards come out, they're going to have persistent effects that activate at the beginning of the boss's turn. So the boss starts by doing stuff to you that's already set up on previous turns. After that, you're going to have a draw phase. So we're going to draw the card that's on the boss deck. And if it's a strike card, you immediately resolve that card. If it's a minion, you put it into play with health tokens. And if it has an effect that says instant, you do it now. If it has an effect that says activate, well, it'll activate next boss turn. So let's flip this over. All right, so this one's a strike called Unrelenting Onslaught. The homeworld suffers 3 damage, increase the artillery track by 1. So our homeworld would take 3 damage, and the artillery track would go up. We have special rules for the artillery track here because at the end of Furion's turn, if the artillery track is 3 or higher, then we're gonna draw cards to the artillery deck, then decrease the artillery track, but we have to do that until it's less than 3. So if Furion gets very furious and has a whole big artillery boost, then we're also gonna suffer from that. So in this case, this card is done, but we only have 1 more boss turn, and then the next time, Furion is going to level up and everything's going to get more difficult. We're going to get more cards of his to deal with. So keep in mind that if the homeworld health goes down to 0, we lose. In a multiplayer game or a multi-Astro Knight game, the Astro Knights lose if they are all exhausted. However, if Zach gets exhausted and he's by himself, then what's going to happen is that we can no longer gain health. The boss is going to gain artillery because we are exhausted, and that's like the special bonus for the boss. And any damage that's dealt to Zach is going to be doubled and dealt to the homeworld. So getting exhausted in solo is still not a free pass. Bad things can still happen, such as draining tremendous health from the homeworld and dealing with negative effects from the boss. So even though you have a little bit of an extended life in one-handed solo play, Don't get too comfortable in it because otherwise the boss will make it very uncomfortable for you. But yeah, from here we would just flip the turn order card and keep going. And this would be another turn for Zach. So that is a brief overview of Astro Knights gameplay. And now I want to go on to some final thoughts because I think that this game offers a lot to discuss, both in itself as a game and inevitably in comparison with Aeon's End.
All right, so now for some final thoughts. As its own thing, Astro Knights is, of course, a great game because it implements a great system. I really love how this deck builder plays. I like that it is cooperative. I love that you don't shuffle your decks because it allows you to set up combos for yourself on future turns. It also just kind of decreases the amount of shuffling and upkeep that there is per round. I like that each of the bosses plays very differently and that they have difficulty levels that allow you to scale for yourself and try each boss in a new and challenging way. The Astro Knights also play a bit differently, and that means that each player boss combination is going to be a little bit different. When it comes to solo play, because this is a cooperative game, you can either just play solo with one Astro Knight, or you can have up to 4. And while I showed you the solo setup for this, because I figured I'm a solo gamer and I should show that off, I actually prefer to play with 2 Astro Knights. And the reason for that is that I prefer to have them coordinate with each other and use their powers together. I'm historically a solo gamer who is comfortable with multi-handing. And I also prefer the 4-to-2 turn ratio against the boss, as opposed to the 3-to-2 that you get in one Astro Knight solo play. So for me, multi-handing is actually the way to go, but playing with one Astro Knight is a viable option that I also tried out and did enjoy. It just has some strategic and balanced shifts that you're gonna have to make if you were used to playing with 2. So because Aeon's End is such a big part of my gaming life, I'm about to launch into comparison between those. But if you've never played Aeon's End and you don't necessarily want to go invest in that huge system, I'm going to tell you right now that Astro Knights would be a buy for you. Mechanically, it is excellent. This is a re-implementation of a deck builder that I consider to be the best in the business. And so if you have not experienced the joys of Aeon's End, then I think that if you want a new starting point to get into a fantastic deck building system, that Astro Knights would be a strong choice. That said, if you're an Aeon's End player, I do think things get a little trickier, and I'm going to explain why. So the first thing that I noticed when playing this is I can tell that there has been some streamlining between Aeon's End and Astro Knights. And I think the main changes have been made to setup, and that's noticeable in 2 different ways. One is that the bosses have their own boss decks, which means you don't have base boss cards that you have to shuffle in and out when you're playing different bosses. And I actually really like that. It kind of reminds me of Sentinels of the Multiverse, where you just picked up a deck for a hero or a boss and off you went. And that is easy, it is convenient, it is nice. I like it. The other streamlining change happens in the market. So in Aeon's End, if you've played it, you have a market that is comprised of 9 cards that can shift each game. There's a certain balance between currency and actual spells that you need to ensure in your market. But essentially you're getting separate piles of cards that you're laying out, and you know exactly what's available to you the entire game, and you strategize based on what you know is going to be available. The market for Astro Knights is different because it's somewhat randomized. It's not a pure river mechanism the way that we got in deck builders past, so something like Star Realms, where you just really don't know what's coming off the deck. There is some control because the cards are divided up by type and price, which means that if you have a specific need, you can get something that's pretty close to fulfilling that need, even if it's not the exact card you want. That said, you're also going to give up some of your strategic power because you don't actually know what's going to come up in a given game or when. So depending on how you like your card markets, this is either a major plus for you because it adds a little bit of randomness and fun, or it's a minus because you really liked the control of knowing exactly what was available and being able to plan for it. One aspect of this, however, that is a major bonus is that setup is a lot easier because instead of having to, shuffle out a bunch of separate cards, figure out how to keep them all stored separately in your box and know how to incorporate them into a game, just shuffling 6 decks of cards and kind of keeping them together at the end of a game is a lot faster. It makes setup a lot easier, and in some ways it reduces stress because you don't have to worry if the combination of cards in the market is ideal or not. You're just going to work with what you have, and not having to kind of micromanage that or worry if you're going random about what assortment you're going to get is actually pretty nice. And I think from those changes, we're going to see kind of a butterfly effect in this game and how it would play differently to Aeon's End, even though it feels largely the same. I also like that boss leveling is just in this game right away. I think that that's really helpful, especially for experienced players who want to get something good out of Astro Knights. And while I really liked the Aeon's End theme, I think that maybe this kind of space comic, it's kind of got like Green Lantern vibes theme for Astro Knights is going to be more widely appealing to families and to newer gamers and to people who want something a little bit less grim looking. That said, if you're really, really deep into Aeon's End and you play it a lot and you've really thought about strategies for this game and how the mages work and you like to play higher complexity mages, or if you like to play the campaigns that emerge in later iterations of the Aeon's End game, or if you like to play the campaigns that emerge in later iterations of Aeon's End, then Astro Knights is not going to have those things for you just yet. You can very much tell that this is the first entry in a series that could grow a lot, just like Aeon's End did. But the starting Astro Knights are not complex the way that some of the wilder mages get in later Aeon's End releases. And while there's great variation among the bosses, there's only 4 of them, you haven't yet reached that incredible state of variety that Aeon's End has at this point. At the same time, I personally feel that Aeon's End is kind of collapsing under its own weight at this point, so it's probably good that we have a fresh start. But if you want to jump in the deep end and play something crazy and tricky the way that you might be used to if you've been playing the other system, then Astro Knights might seem maybe overly simple and not interesting to you just yet. The other thing that's missing from Astro Knights, at least for now, is that expedition system that started to appear in New Age and beyond. And so you won't be able to play little mini campaigns in this game yet. Although obviously I would say that in a future release, if this game does well, they're totally going to implement it because why wouldn't they? Nobody's actually told me that that's going to happen, but it just seems like an obvious evolution of the game to me. So if you're an Aeon's End devotee, then I think Astro Knights is going to be a maybe for you, and it depends on how attached you are to the specifics of the mechanisms of Aeon's End and how hungry you are for a fresh start, as opposed to still happy with high degrees of complexity because you've played the game so much. If you want to kind of wipe the table clean, maybe you had some Aeon's End, but not a whole lot, and you want a fresh start, then I think that Astro Knights is a very good buy. If you're very attached to Aeon's End exactly the way it is, and changes will annoy you rather than make you think, fresh start, then know that about yourself going in, because otherwise you might be setting yourself up for some disappointment. There's some other small mechanical changes that you'll notice when playing Astro Knights. So even if you are an experienced Aeon's End player, make sure you really read the rulebook to check up on all the little things, because I find myself doing things slightly wrong occasionally because I had remembered an old system. So with that said, should you get Astro Knights? That's really a question I always leave to you. I think that this is a great gaming system, and I say that because I loved its predecessor so much, and this one plays roughly the same way, but with a streamlined setup. If you were only mildly into Aeon's End and you just never got really deep with it, or if you've never played Aeon's End, I think this game is a great choice because I personally love this system, and this is a great way to onboard into it. If you're an experienced Aeon's End player, kind of know yourself and go in with the right expectations, and that will help you decide whether to make this buy. If you are looking for a fresh start yourself, or you just love Aeon's End a lot and you want to try a more streamlined implementation, if setup was what annoyed you the most about the game, then Astro Knights is going to solve a lot of problems for you. If you really liked that constructed market and you like playing the more complicated mages, then you either have to get this with the expectation that it's not going to be a fully grown game yet, or wait for a few more releases, and that's going to be up to you. Alternatively, you can just decide that you're happy with Aeon's End. It's still a fabulous game. I'm not ever letting anybody tell me otherwise. You can pry it out of my cold, dead hands. So hopefully that gives you some perspective on Astro Knights and what you're getting, and gives you some food for thought as you consider whether to pick it up. Thank you so much for watching this Kickstarter preview. Please do like and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my work, and most of all, happy gaming.